Okay, we are now live and just giving it some more time before we start. I see a lot of people on the call actually, over 80, approaching 90. So, okay. Hello everyone. So this is Hannah again from the Lloyd's Asia Market Development Team based here in Singapore. Welcome to our Academy's APMEA Emerging Risk Series 2025 that's happening every Tuesday and Wednesday throughout May. So if you joined us for yesterday's session, then welcome back. But if this is your first time with us, then a very, very special and warm welcome to you today. Just to share a little bit more, each of our sessions in this series is designed to bring you fresh insights, practical tips, as well as plenty of opportunities later to engage with our speaker. So before we begin, I'd just like to share a quick disclaimer. The views expressed here by our speaker today are their own and do not necessarily reflect those of Lloyd's Corporation and service companies. This series is intended for educational as well as informational purposes only, and please remember that nothing shared here constitutes as a formal piece of advice or is an official Lloyd's position. So a lot of people might be curious in terms of CPD hours. To receive one CPD hour for this webinar, please stay until the end and complete a feedback form, and I'll share the link later with you in the function that we have during this meeting. And also use the Q&A function to ask Andy lots of questions throughout this meeting. So without further ado, I'm very, very excited to introduce our speaker for today's session on the silent cargo, how bad data sinks ships, markets, as well as supply chain. He is none other than Andy McKeown, CEO and co-founder of Blockchain. He is a chartered logistician with over 20 years of experience leading digital transformation across global trade and supply chains. So now I'll hand the time over to Andy and he'll kickstart his sharing. So Andy, over to you.
Anna, thanks very much. And thanks again to Lloyd for arranging the series and inviting myself along to give this talk today. I've been very much looking forward to this. And to everyone in the audience, good morning, good afternoon. Hopefully this will be an informative and maybe perhaps enjoyable session on how bad data is a risk to global trade. So as Hannah mentioned, I'm Andy McKeown, the CEO of Blockchain. My mission, and quite frankly, my obsession, is to help fix the invisible cracks in global trade, starting with how we handle data. So for just before we jump into this, just a little bit of context on myself and Blockchain. I was originally a civil engineer on the railway in the UK, and that is when I first got introduced into trade, logistics, and supply chain, and quite quickly got fascinated by the complex and nebulous and crazy world that it is. And I've been very fortunate to have a very interesting career, taking me from everywhere from the Arctic Circle to living in a shipping container in the world's biggest minefield in Iraq, on the border of Iran. I've run businesses in Africa, across Asia, and a few years ago founded Blockchain out of frustration to try and bring the industry into the 21st century. And I'm very proud to say that the team, idealized, organized, and executed the world's first fully digitalized movement of goods, which is a landmark moment in trade. So we do, all of us at Blockchain have a fascination with everything data to try and improve trade for everybody. Now, today, what we're talking about is what we call the silent cargo. Now, this isn't the steel or the soybeans or the semiconductors or shipping containers that you insure or move. It's the data that rides alongside and inside every shipment. And when data goes wrong, the consequences can be catastrophic. Over the next 30 to 40 minutes, we'll unpack how bad data sinks not only ships, but entire markets and supply chains. And more importantly, what we can do about it. I'll make a promise to you up front, no fluff, no buzzwords, just the reality, the risks, and a few blunt truths. Now, one of the brilliant things that I'm very fortunate about in terms of my career is I've developed a very thick skin. So please, at the end, if you have any blunt or direct or awkward questions to ask, please feel free to put them into the chat for Hannah to put towards me. We really hope that you in the audience get something out of this talk. So, the hidden threat of bad data. Let's start with the obvious that often gets ignored, is that data is the invisible cargo moving through every single supply chain. All physical trade, there are always three flows involved, and that's the data flow, the financial flow, and the physical flow. The physical flows and the financial flows are often well understood and accepted, but often the data flow is quite often ignored, which has serious impacts. It's not the thing that you insure or load or unload, but the data is what tells you what's on that ship or on that plane, where it's going, what it is, and whether it's safe or not. Now, here's the problem. When that data is wrong, late, or incomplete, you don't just get an inconvenience, you can get catastrophe. This isn't just some emerging futuristic risk. This is here, now, and has already cost many, many lives and billions of dollars. Without data integrity, global trade is very much like playing Russian roulette. And the worst part, most of the industry still pretends that we can solve 21st century risks with 20th century tools. Now, here's where the theory hits the real world. When data fails, the consequences are brutal, expensive, and even explosive. Bad data doesn't just ruin spreadsheets. It destroys markets, shatters supply chains, and sadly takes lives. What we'll look at next are some of the hard lessons written in loss, tragedy, and irreversible cost. The MSC Flaminia was a slow motion disaster and is very much a landmark case in terms of trade, insurance, and risk. In 2012, while crossing the Atlantic, a fire ripped through the ship. The root cause? Hazardous chemicals that were somewhat misdeclared and stored in the wrong place. Now, the human cost was 3 crew members lost their lives. Financial cost was nearly $300 million in damages, years of litigation, and serious reputational damage across the supply chain. But the heart of this was one thing. It was data failure. No one had the right cargo data, no one flagged the delays, and nobody acted on that risk. This wasn't just an operational miss. It was a system-wide failure to see that silent cargo. Now, yes, in the court of law, the final judgment on this was that there was a misdeclaration of the cargo. That was really not the fatal mistake that happened here. What happened was it was a containerized load of hazardous chemicals that were being loaded from Houston into Europe, loaded into standard tank containers, 20-foot tank containers. Now, what had happened is that the vessel that it was due to be loaded to actually sailed without the cargo, what's often known in the industry as short shipped. So that tank had to sit on the extremely hot quayside of Houston and was faced with unending sun. And unfortunately, this set off the timer to what was going to be now a landmark case and a genuine disaster on a number of different fronts. That container, filled with these hazardous chemicals, got to a point of temperature where runaway chemical reaction took place that could not be halted. Had data been at the forefront of this supply chain, then not only could the shipping line have had better knowledge of what this actual cargo was, but the fatal step in terms of the supply chain, in terms of it missing that first vessel, the fix would have been simple. It could have been shunted back to the plant in Houston, could have been put back into storage tank, which is correctly temperature controlled and safe, and then could be again decanted into a transport piece of equipment for the next voyage. That didn't happen, and it led to these very serious incidents. Now, even larger than the MSC Flaminia was the Tianjin incident. They poured up in Xinjiang in China. This is one of the most devastating port disasters in modern history. Explosions tore through the port after hazardous goods, smuggled and mislabeled and misdeclared as non-hazardous, ignited. The toll from this was staggering. 173 lives lost and more than $9 billion worth of damage, and a paralyzed port that affected all of global trade. But again, at its core, this was about data failure. The smuggled cargo wasn't tracked. The risks were buried, and when the firefighters arrived, they had no idea what they were up against. So if anyone is in the audience is familiar with this incident, there are many videos on the internet of this incident. And the most famous is the huge fireball. There was an initial explosion, and almost an hour later, there's a widely filmed explosion. That explosion wiped out the majority of the first responders in the fire department in that area. Of the 173 lives lost, more than 100 of them were first responders because they attended the port and they were given details of where the fire was taking place within the port. And this was a well-practiced, well-drilled exercise. So they saw that this fire was taking place in what they thought was the non-hazardous storage area of the port, which caused them to arrange a slew of water cannons around the fire to then douse it, which would have worked had that data been correct. Sadly, it wasn't. They set up enormous water cannons that poured massive tons of water onto the explosion, which caused the chemicals involved, which fortunately for them were reactive to water, caused an enormous explosion, wiping out all of these brave first responders. When we fail to see the silent cargo, we don't just use goods, we gamble with lives. Now, the numbers on this incident are thought by many experts to be a lot more considerable than what was reported by the Chinese government. This was one of the largest non-nuclear explosions in history, and it was measured internationally as measuring 2.3 on the Richter scale, all due to bad data. Beirut, unfortunately, this is an incident that still has ongoing knock-on effects today. The Beirut explosion was a tragedy, and it should have been impossible. In 2020, nearly 3,000 tons of ammonium nitrate sitting neglected in a port for years detonated with a force that flattened entire city blocks. The initial blast killed 218 people, caused $20 billion in damage, and left hundreds of thousands homeless, as well as destroying, you've seen that middle picture there, the grain silo for Beirut and the surrounding cities, which then led to a humanitarian crisis, which had knock-on effects in terms of deep international political shockwaves that followed. Yet again, the root cause here was data failure. No clear inventory records, no accountability, and no risk management. Everyone assumed that somebody else was watching this silent cargo. Now, this cargo was placed into that warehouse after it had been seized from a vessel. But you had paperwork, traditional paperwork, essentially floating from one department to another, from one office to another. And this is what happens when data goes missing. It's not just a gap, it is a ticking time bomb. Now, a little bit less doom and gloom, and I do apologize that those in the audience, we're not trying to be overly bombastic with sharing this information, But what we do want to do is get across to you all as professionals in the risk management industry that data is something serious and it needs to be tackled and taken to task. Data is not just a risk, but it can be turned into an opportunity, especially in the world of risk management, not just trade at large. And a good example of this was the global chip shortage. This didn't happen overnight. It was a bit of a slow burn that caught almost every industry off guard. From 2020 until 2023, the semiconductor supply chains buckled under a perfect storm. COVID shutdowns, spiking demand, partly due to the working at home, and crucially, broken, fragmented data flows across a system. Outdated methods such as just-in-time philosophies with supply chains, with bad data, was one of the key causes of this incident. Now, the result? $210 billion effect to the auto sector alone, with a ripple effects across 169 industries, from smartphones to washing machines. Semiconductors are very much like data in the modern world, that they shouldn't be considered as a vertical, they are a horizontal. Both data and semiconductors are ever present in every single part of our lives. And that's why one of the reasons for this particular supply chain impact was so devastating to global trade, and it was very, very far-reaching indeed. This wasn't just a pandemic problem. It was a visibility and transparency problem. Without end-to-end data, genuine, clean end-to-end data, companies were flying blind, making decisions reactively rather than proactively. We don't just connect the dots. We don't just need to connect the dots in our data. We need to have a much better understanding, because small disruptions can cascade very quickly into a genuine global crisis. So, what do these stories tell us? First, that data is not just a tech issue. It's a fundamental business risk. Second is that the cost goes far beyond money. We're talking about lives lost, families destroyed, trust shattered, and entire industries thrown into chaos. And third, fixing this just doesn't come down to someone buying more tools or hiring more consultants. We need a blueprint. We need a playbook for resilience. As we're seeing, there's a lot going on in the world now in terms of the world of trade. And it shows you how one issue with one industry or one country can have far-reaching and quite often unseen impacts and effects to the world of trade. Now, we mentioned earlier that when it comes to the physical trade, there are the three flows. You have the physical flow, the financial flow, and the data flow. Now, ever since the advent of Web 2, Internet's been more and more involved in commerce, data has outpaced everything. It's outpaced the other two flows. And some of the data here is, the exponential growth of data is quite staggering. Before we get into some of the frameworks in terms of how we can look to mitigate the risk of bad data, let's zoom out and get some perspective. From 2015 to 2035, the data volume will explode from 15.5 zettabytes to over 2,100 zettabytes. It's 138x growth. By comparison, trade volumes may triple or quintuple, and financial flows will roughly double. So data is not just another line item. It is no longer a vertical, it is a horizontal, woven through everything we touch in trade and in finance. And that's what makes managing it both a challenge and a massive opportunity. But quite often, numbers are meaningless to humans. A billion is extremely hard to actually visualize. And understand. So what on earth does more than 2,000 zettabytes look like? We don't have to be always so serious in these talks. To put this into perspective, 2,142 zettabytes equals 714 trillion hours of Netflix. So put that into perspective, that's 81 billion years of binge watching, more than 6 times the age of the universe. But we're not just dealing with big numbers, we're dealing with mind-bending scale. And if we don't have the right frameworks and practices in place, we're just setting up ourselves and our partners and the world of trade at large for bigger failures and faster. We should not just throw more tools at the problem, but fundamentally transform how we manage that data. And that's why at Logchain, we have developed the risk and trade frameworks. And that's what we're looking to unpack next. We should, as mentioned, we should not be looking to just throw more tools at this problem, but fundamentally transform how we manage the data that we deal with in our everyday lives and trade. Now, let's take a look at some of these frameworks. Risk: recognize, integrate, secure, know. Risk is the shield. It's what keeps the system standing when the shitstorm hits. Risk framework is how we stop failure from before it starts. We recognize, we spot the gaps, the blind spots, the misdeclared cargo, the dodgy paperwork. Think MSC Flaminia, recognizing hazardous cargo. That data could have changed everything. Integrate, connect your data, no more silos. The vast majority of technology that is being brought into the industry, whether it be trade, logistics, or supply chain, or risk management, insurance, reinsurance, brokerage, the vast majority of data and technology that's being brought into this industry quite often starts at the white collar level. Unfortunately, that's too late. The vast majority of trade data was created by and interacted with blue collar workers on the ground. That's where trade exists. It's in the hands of the many logisticians around the world. That's why we can have no more data silos. We must capture this data at the event level. This isn't just about compliance, it's about speed. It can give you much sharper forecasts with real-time decision powers, and can also assist in terms of market entry by understanding the data that drives that market. Secure: protect your data from cyber attacks and accidental leaks. Blue Yonder, M&S, we've all seen what happens when digital walls fail. Now, we are in the midst of trade wars at the moment. This was predicted last year. And what has been often discussed is that the second round of trade wars will indeed be the attack and cyber attacks on data. We've already seen it over the last few weeks. There's been a number of high profile, quite trusted platforms that have been taken down for various cyber attacks. A few years ago, Maersk, at the time was the world's largest shipping line, went down due to a ransomware attack. Now, that one incident with one company actually put a permanent blip in terms of impact into global GDP. Again, it shows you how one incident, even with one company, can have wide-reaching impacts. And make no mistake, again, don't want to be doom and gloom here, but the risk of cyber warfare, data access is only going to increase over the next 10 years because trade digitalization is coming, which is going to bring with it an enormous amount of opportunities, but it does also bring risk. As we move the world from paper to digital, whether it's digitized or digitalized, if not managed correctly, it's only going to bring in more risks than it actually prevents. So globally, when you look at cybersecurity, the two biggest entry points for any attack is, number one is email phishing. And unfortunately, we can't fix that. We as humans, we're Not very smart yesterday, we're not very smart today, and probably won't be very smart tomorrow. But the second biggest entry point for all cyber attacks globally is the supply chain. Because quite often companies engaged in supply chain don't realize the actors and stakeholders that they're engaging with, all the data. With various different formats as data goes in and out of the digital realm. And this prevents a real and present danger to all companies that are involved in the world of trade, logistics, supply chain. We have seen what happens when digital walls fail. Yes, we need to break down the silos, but still, in the world of trade, we do need to have some secure walls. Now, the other part about this is you need to know what is going across the visibility in the supply chain. So you can act upon anomalies and engage with those anomalies before they turn into disasters. If Beirut had had that visibility, we might not be telling that story today. Now, know is one of the most important parts of the risk framework. By having that data at your fingertips, sorry, it allows you to have a much more robust trading system. Now, risk might be the shield for your business, and trade is an opportunity. This is where we stop surviving and start transforming. This is where data can become an opportunity, not just a risk. And a big part of that is trust. More and more these days, trust is a hugely important part of the global trade system. If people can't trust the data, the system breaks. Tianjin was a failure of trust at scale. If people can't trust the data, they're not going to trust you as a partner in global trade. Record, get it right, do it once, and capture it at the source. It's faster, it's cheaper, and it's way less painful than patching mistakes downstream. As mentioned, the vast majority of trade data, the events as physical goods move around the world, happen on the shop floor, in the warehouse, in the cabs of the millions of trucks that keeps the physical trade moving around the world. When we record this data, we need to do this once. Through our work at Logchain, we get to see behind the curtain of trade. And it's one of the reasons why we wanted to do this. Everyone in Logchain has a huge passion for this. When you look at the data journeys within supply chains, it can be quite interesting to watch how often data will move in and out of the physical realm. It's why record is so important. Take the very simple one piece of data. Let's take a look at one piece of data within the supply chain, which is the actual weight of the goods themselves, which is quite often achieved through a weighbridge. It's a piece of equipment, either at factories or at third-party providers to provide the weight. You weigh the truck, the trailer, the shipping container, empty, you weigh it full, one minus the other gives you the weight of the goods. Now, through the UN-led VGM, the verified gross mass, this is now a legal requirement. Believe it or not, it wasn't that long ago that the VGM actually came into law. Now, just this one data element goes in and out of the physical and digital realms across the entire supply chain. When that initial weight is taken, quite often that data is produced by the weighbridge. It's printed out, yes, on a printed out ticket by that weighbridge operator. That'll be passed to a driver. The weighbridge operator will quite often capture that data into an Excel sheet on a desktop running Windows 95, and I'm not exaggerating. These are some of the things that we get to see. Now, the crazy data journey starts with that driver. That driver will quite often text, WhatsApp, call the trucking controller at the office. They will pass on that data. That could be verbally. It could be a copy and paste. It could be a picture. That data internally at the trucking company is passed to a customer service team who quite often enter that into their own system. That is then sent off to a freight forwarder managing the actual shipment itself. Now that could be, again, on email. They'll receive that data. That data will then again be put into their own internal system. That data is then sent to people like customs, the shipping line, and the actual customer where that truck is sitting. This is only at the port of loading. That entire data journey goes into reverse at the port of discharge. This is just one piece of data in the supply chain in moving physical goods around the world. And it shows you how that data moves in and out of the physical world. We need to capture that data at source. We need to digitalize the process in order to make it robust and mitigate the risk. Record, do it right, do it once. Now, once we have it recorded, now we can automate, take out the manual choke points. The global chip shortage, automation could have helped balance supply chain with demand a lot easier. You think about that data journey that we just talked about in terms of that weight moving in and out of the physical realm. The delays in this data as well can be with time zones, often data trade flows, physical trade flows flow from east to west. So you've got consignors in Asia, you've got consignees in North America, in Europe. These are the main two trade flows from Asia. So if there are any issues with that weight, it's not the correct weight, it's overweight, it's underweight. Quite often you've got to live with those time zone differences before a query, a problem, or a challenge can be lodged. Now, if you have automated and semi-automated workflows, if you have everybody working within one data stream or one data lake, then this is how you can automate some of the most mundane tasks. And trust me, a lot of the tasks involved in moving global trade are extremely automated. We have billionaires going to space, taking selfies, but we can't send a shipping container across a stretch of water without the use of clipboards, Excel, and fax machines. And it needs to stop. We can automate this. We can make it a lot more efficient. And again, if you're recording this data correctly, you can detect seamlessly, see the risks, you can see the fraud, and see the gaps as they emerge, not after they have done the damage. And this can allow proactivity in terms of trade, supply chain, and risk management. Now, you've recorded, you've detected. This will allow you, this will allow the industry, this will allow governments around the world and international organizations to enforce. This is where it all lands. Accountability, compliance, confidence. This is not a nice to have. This needs to be baked in how you trade. Trade, the framework, it isn't tech, it's a mindset. It's a mindset shift. It's how we turn global trade into something fit for the future. Mitigating, managing some of the risks and opportunities around trade. A lot of people think this is a technology issue. A lot of people think that this is a global technology project. It is not. This is changing the mindset. This is changing your mindset, those of your peers, and those are the people that work with you and for you. The digitalization of trade and the management of data risks is not a technology project, it's a people project. It's never the what, it's always the why. And behind the why, the people. We need to change our mind shift so that we can manage trade more efficiently, more effectively, and mitigate risk. But also, there are so many opportunities in terms of managing the risk with data. Turn that risk into an opportunity. We need to look for the data. It is behind every single risk. Again, this goes back to it's a horizontal, not a vertical. Data touches everything that we'll ever hear about. There are some amazing talks that are coming up in this series that have been organized by the Lloyd's Academy. Now, whether it's modern slavery, where transparency can uncover unethical practices, again, by recording, capturing that data correctly. Whether it's supply chain finance, where accurate data improves credit decisions and also cuts, reduces, and mitigates fraud. And frontier markets, where reliable data helps assess risk in volatile conditions. I got personal experience of this. I've lived and ran businesses in Zambia, and the cost of capital across all of Africa is extremely, extremely high. And quite often that comes down to the risk. And quite often that comes down to the data, either missing data or data, quite frankly, that isn't trusted by finance, insurance, and risk management professionals. So as we are seeing, there's a lot of issues in global trade at the moment, but it's opening up other markets. There are a lot of people in global trade, especially out here in Asia, who are looking to enter into new markets because some of the challenges that we're seeing in the United States. So making sure you'll capture the data that you need as you go into these emerging markets allows you to mitigate the risk from these emerging markets while also increasing your market access. And we cannot forget cyber risk, where data governance will be the bedrock of protection. The common thread here is clear. Without trusted, transparent, resilient data, every other risk becomes much harder to manage. That's why this conversation matters. And I hope, as you hear, as with the other speakers, you'll keep one question in mind. What's this data story behind the risk? It is time to trade without fear, where risk meets reward. In a world where data increasingly drives global commerce, every byte, every bit matters. Don't just survive in your supply chain, digitally master it. Risk and trade aren't just standalone tools. They're complementary forces. Risk strengthens your defenses. It's about resilience, proactive threat mitigation, and making sure that your house is in order before the storm hits. Trade pushes you forward. It optimizes and transforms your processes, strengthening relationships, and unlocks growth. Used together, they can create a holistic approach, robust data governance, operational transparency, and real-time responsiveness across the entire supply chain, and anything that you are managing through risk mitigation. That's the real power here. It's not just about avoiding disaster. It's about turning risk into reward, uncertainty into opportunity. Because in global trade, the line between chaos and clarity isn't luck. It's how well you manage your risk and how you master your trade. Be bold, be curious, get involved. Thank you so much for your time today. And I would love to hear any questions and comments that you might have on this talk. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Andy. I feel that this presentation was a really insightful. First of all, I think apart from the two frameworks that you shared, there are a lot of quotes I think we can gather from this sharing itself, right? So later I'll share more about the quotes that I picked up from you. But so while we give it some time for the Q&A to come through, I have some questions. And I think the first one many of us are asking, and it goes back to one of the slides I saw, the what you wrote was, that we need a blueprint, or rather a playbook for resilience. And so if you can share with us, just how to get started on this, how to kind of, as risk managers, how do we kind of have a blueprint ready if we want to get started, and data is already on the top of our minds. Yeah.
Oh, thanks, Hannah. I mean, I think this is where the risk and trade frameworks really come in. Now, what I would advise anyone to do themselves within their team or within their organization is don't try and boil the ocean. It's how do you eat an elephant? It's one bite at a time. So one of the things that we do, we are involved with multiple different governments. We're involved with private sector companies, from micro companies all the way up to multinationals. And no matter how big the size of a supply chain is or an organization, we always start small. We need to have proof points, and we need to have and gain those proof points quite quickly. Because, again, as mentioned during the talk, this is not a technology project, it's a people project.
Yeah.
And people fear what they don't understand and they kill what they fear. So I always advise people to do pilots, very small scale pilots. Smaller the better, because larger pilots, larger projects, unfortunately means committees. And committees is where authority and ideas go to die. What you need to do is have small teams of the willing, of the energetic. We always say in LogChain, we look for energy, not acquiescence. If you do a small pilot, you can collect proof points quickly. You can then present that to your peers, to your partners, to your organization, and say, look what we've achieved here at this scale. You can then get people on board, because it does take a village. And I love the African proverb: if you want to go fast, you go alone. If you want to go far, go together.
Right. I see. Thank you for that. I do think, yes, you are right that, before you get started, you definitely have to gather the right group of people and then embark on that project, and everybody is clear about the why, right? So I think another question I think leading into this is, are there some kind of common, you think, data practices or common processes that kind of increase systemic risk for maybe risk managers or underwriters or group of people who are already gathered together, but sometimes they are not aware of what are the usual practices that might, increase the risk in organizations. Yeah.
I think the most important one is obtaining the source of the data.
Okay.
So even in risk management, it does, I mean, they call it supply chain for a reason. You've just got a series of links. And unfortunately, people are often only involved with data in their own link, or the immediate upstream or the immediate downstream link. I think what we have to do is stop accepting that we got the data from the previous person in the chain. We've got it upstream, so that's the data. We need to be bold. We need to be curious enough to turn around and say, where did this data come from? No, not from that department, not from that person, not from that company. Where did the data originate? So again, that goes back to the framework of recording. Don't just accept data that is presented to you. Find out where that data is collected. I mean, look, there's a lot of exciting things that are going on in the world of trade and digitalization at the moment, such as the e-bill of lading. It's a fantastic initiative, but you've got an electronic bill of lading, quite often put onto blockchain, but the inputs into it are manual and analog. So what are you digitizing? It's the old adage when it comes to computers, crap in, crap out. So we need to find out where that data originates and start there.
Okay, thank you for that. Well, okay, it is really quiet here in the chat. Please, I encourage everyone, if you have any questions for Andy, please send them through our Q&A function. But if not, I have few other questions going. So aligning according to the recognized, in the pillar in the risk framework, right? What do you think are some of the early warning signs that you think maybe, in all the clients you work with, that their company's data is at risk? And how do you think they can kind of proactively address these vulnerabilities? Yeah.
It's a good question. And I think that's where, again, once you've recorded the information, you need to understand what is normal, what is general within that data. And then what you can do is to establish tolerances for variability.
Okay.
Because that way it can mitigate risk. There was a ship a number of years ago. It was actually a car carrier, and they had a wonderful computer system for calculating ballast in terms of the weight of the vessel, in terms of the right amount of balance compared to the amount of cargo was loaded into this.
Yeah.
Now, unfortunately, there was a change in terms of the shipment, in terms of the sailing and the port that it was going to go to, the cargo would collect, and therefore the balance. So this involved someone manually changing the data, within the system, and they were asked to do this. Now, what happened is they got the numbers wrong by an order of 100.
Uh-oh.
So that vessel sank. and that was another $200 million
Oh,
claim.
wow.
So again, within systems, if
Human
you
error.
understand, well, it's not just human error. We're always going to, even with the AI and robotics, we're always going to have humans involved in supply chain. So
Yeah.
what we have to do is make sure that we manage, exception management needs to be a lot better. There's no way that that system should have allowed to have data put into it which was off by 2, 3 decimal points.
Yeah.
That's where you can start to put data alerts into a system.
Okay. And you mentioned earlier on cargo, right? So now we have a question by one of the viewers, and they're asking, what do you think insurers can or should do to try to reduce the risk to cargoes and vessels?
Again, I would say this is about getting data from source.
Mm.
You need to understand what's actually being shipped. So when you look, one of the main data elements for shipping cargo internationally is what's called the HS code, the harmonized system. Now, that's a series of 6 to 12 to varying different number lengths in terms of detail.
Okay.
Now, the ironic thing here, as what's typical with global trade, is even though it's called the harmonized system, it's not harmonized. So one country can have a code for one piece of
Yeah.
goods and another for another piece of good. Now, this is where I think people like Lloyd and people in risk management need to start pushing government harder in terms of having greater interoperability of data. Because quite often, declaration of cargo, honestly, the majority of misdeclaration of cargo is done not for malicious reasons. It's people not understanding the cargo correctly. But there's a lot of cargo. So whether that's semiconductors trying to get around some of the tariff bans in North America, or whether it's things like charcoal, which present a great risk to vessels, it's about understanding what that product actually is. And again, that's about going upstream to where the data is. Because if you're involved in risk management, insurance, etc., quite often you are getting the information for that insurance from brokers, from logistics people. They could be given that information incorrectly, whether intentionally or not. This is where risk management professionals need to start insisting from their clients, from their customers, from their partners, and from governments around the world that they obtain the data from source. Actually, and it is possible. We have the technology to do this today. But what we don't have is that willingness of mindset for people to be more unreasonable in terms of data demands.
Okay, I think this kind of lean nicely into the next question that has come in. So it seems that the focus here is a lot about product data. If you'd like to clarify this in the presentation, it's about product data, but someone is asking to clarify what do you mean by data at source, and is there any way to get access to this?
Yeah, so data at source, but what I mean by that is every event in the world of trade, it has an ignition, a start event.
Okay.
So whether that piece of good has been created, so that's at the end of the production line. So you can find out the composition, you can find out the size, the quantities. So instead of taking that data from someone 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 links down the chain, from the freight forwarder, everybody in the world should be feeding into one data lake. Because if you have a secure and robust data lake and you know where that source comes from, why are we asking shipping lines to provide the data on cargo? Why are we asking freight forwarders to provide the data on cargo? It's the manufacturers who have that data. And time again, we see whether it's shipping lines or whether it's logistics professionals providing the wrong information to insurance and risk professionals, either intentionally or unintentionally. So again, going back to the comment I said earlier, there's such a big focus. I think, look, I started as a blue collar worker, but I've gone into white collar workers. Probably every single person in this audience is a white collar worker. And that's a bit of a problem because people don't understand, people don't appreciate that global trade, it originates and is managed by the blue collar workers on the ground. Whether it's the weight of a shipping container, whether it's the weight of a box that's being picked up from a shelf that's being put onto a pallet, these are blue collar workers on the ground handling the physical goods. What we need to do, we need to move past digitization and move into digitalization. So that's something that we're very kind of pedantic about. So everybody says digitize and digitalize as if they're interchangeable. We're very pedantic on this. So digitize is paper into PDFs.
Okay.
That was great last century, but now it doesn't add value. And you're still stuck with paperwork, whether it's hard copy or soft copy. What we need to do is actually transform. It's not disrupt. We don't need to disrupt the industry. We need to transform it. Disrupt is a silly Silicon Valley phrase, and it doesn't fit into our industry. Disruption in our industry is a ship going sideways in the sewers. It's not a good thing. What we need to do is actually digitalize the processes. So whether it's Bob in the warehouse or a truck driver delivering goods to a port, we need to capture the data that is important for the risk managers to capture and have that go into a data lake, which can then be captured, recorded, and automated.
Mm. Okay, I think we still
answers the question.
Yes. So I have one more question. I think we still have some time. So, you mentioned that, right? This is, digitalization is more like a people project. So along this, the same lines of, convincing stakeholders and understanding the different stakeholders in each part of the supply chain, right? What do you think are the biggest challenges in terms of convincing the stakeholders or getting stakeholder buy-in, right, when it comes to investing in trade digitalization?
It's a great question, and to be honest, it's probably a really good one to end on, because it's the crux. It's the crux of both the opportunity and the challenges. So let's be real about this. Let's be honest. So one of the reasons why Bob in the warehouse rolls his eyes when you say that there's another trade digitalization project is he's seen all these failures. So over the last 10 or 15 years, there's been more than 20 billion that's been spent and wasted on trade digitalization. Now, the numbers behind this are pretty scary. The failure rate for trade digitalization projects is between 60 and 92%. Let's be honest, would you invest in something with that higher failure rate? Because unfortunately, everybody's realized the opportunity within the world of trade, and it's attracted technologists, very intelligent technologists, but quite often without that domain expertise. So that's led to a lack of trust. That's why Bob in the warehouse rolls his eyes when you talk about trade digitalization. He has seen projects come and go and fail. Do you know what's never let him down? His clipboard. So how are you going to get him to trust him? You need to show him proof points. But this also goes back to culture. There's a reason why we ended the slide with be bold, be curious, get involved. Time and time again, whether it's public sector or private sector projects that we're involved in, it's the leadership culture that makes the difference.
Mm.
I quite often call it the 6 magic words for business. I don't know, and I effed up. Now, you need to be brave and honest about this. We work with organizations which make some incredible goods, world-leading goods, but they don't understand their own supply chain. And I'll be honest with you, most people don't. Yeah. They simply don't understand it. So again, going back to that, be bold, be curious, and get involved. You need to have a good culture. And there'll be a lot of people in this audience or in leadership positions. It's down to you to make sure that there is this culture within an organization. Now, the good news is you can spread this like a positive virus. Because again, if you start small, if you do a small proof of concept pilot or project, don't try and boil the ocean. If you start with a small project, collect the proof points, not only can you show that to leadership across your organization, but also, importantly, to Bob in the warehouse. This isn't just about making decisions in boardrooms. This is about having people on the ground buy into this.
Okay, now I'm conscious of time. We have 4 minutes left, but we have one more very interesting question, so I'm going to shoot that over. How do inaccuracies in supply chain data affect insurance underwriting for logistics and cargo? especially now looking at the surge of AI and its usage by professionals in the industry?
That's a great question. So I would go back to the MSc Flaminia on this. So one of the reasons why it was such a landmark case is, unfortunately, quite often vessel incidents like this that involve a total loss get dumped upon the risk management and insurance professionals. MSc Flaminia was a landmark case because it went to court and the judges actually decided, no, enough. So they apportioned blame 60% to the logistics provider and 40% to the actual manufacturer. Now, this was because they hadn't provided the right, correct, and timely data. From a risk management point of view, I would honestly say the key to all of this is data. It is capturing its source. Now, whether that leads to, we have to remember that improving data management is not going to solve all issues, but it will mitigate them massively. So even if there is an issue that comes out from that data that you have recorded, at least you know who provided that data so they can be held accountable. When you look at all of these, and there's going to be more and more vessel incidents, the number of vessel incidents and number of vessel fires is actually increasing, not decreasing. So the number of lives lost at sea over the last 150 years has been going down thanks to efforts of people, thanks to technology. But if you look at the number of incidents, they're increasing. And that's not just to do with the volume of trade. As a percentage, the number of risks are increasing. You add into that impacts of climate change. You know, there are some challenging times ahead for people involved in risk management. We don't grab a hold of that data today.
Yeah. Okay, thank you, Andy, for all the insights and sharing, through the start of the presentation and now also for the Q&A. It was really very engaging, and I think it'll be very beneficial to all the people dialing in here today. So I think if I can have one key takeaway to share, I like to pick up a quote that you mentioned, right? What is the data story behind each of the risks that it's priority or top of the mind for be it an individual or for the organization? So any final comments before I close off today's webinar?
Honestly, I would say be bold, be curious, and get involved.
Cool. Okay, thank you everyone. I have now dropped the feedback form link in our discussion Q&A chat. So please feel free to click in and then complete the feedback form and let us know what you think about today's session for the silent cargo. And once again, on behalf of everyone here, lovely to have over 100 and I think almost close 160 people on the call. Thank you, Andy, again for your time and for doing this presentation. Have a lovely afternoon.
Thank you, everybody. Take care.
Thank you. Bye, Andy. Thank you all. Bye-bye.